All right, what's going on, fellas? Welcome to Training Questions, I believe number 65. Every Sunday on the Thursday, apparently. My apologies on the delay. I ended up getting a little bit busier than I expected, but back to the Sunday as usual, starting next Sunday. Didn't want to miss this week, though, because you guys gave me a ton of good questions, and I laughed really hard. I put my phone away. I didn't log into my YouTube for a little bit after I put up the community post where you guys give me your training-related questions. Hopefully, I can help you out. I didn't look at my phone for a little bit. I picked it up, and I went to check. I'm like, I wonder if anybody's giving me their questions. When I saw a bunch of them in all caps, I was cackling. That's I like you guys, and these questions are damn good this week. I'm not gonna lie. Last week's questions, kind of, they're decent questions, but this week's questions, a lot of bangers. Appreciate you boys. So let's just get straight into it. I'm hopefully gonna have time to do timestamps. Everybody's been harassing me, Sam, I need timestamps, Sam, I need timestamps. And it's like, I made $15, I believe, this month on YouTube. I'm already chalking aside an hour and a half to get this done. If I have time, I will do it. But that being said, I have a job that is actually what pays the bills that obviously is going to take priority in my own training. And if I have the time, I'll do it. I'm not giving you guys timestamps on the 10-minute videos. If you can't find what I was talking about, that's a you problem. But I totally get that it's very helpful for these longer format, many question ones to be able to skim through. I get it. I'll hopefully get those done tonight. So straight into the questions. If your goal was to increase your front squat 1RM, how different would your training be versus chasing a back squat 1RM? Would it be as simple as just swapping back squats for front squats in your current training program? No, it probably wouldn't be identical, right? Due to the decreases in absolute load, the fact that I'm pretty favorably built for a front squat, you'd probably see a little bit more volume, a little bit more frequency. I could probably lean into those a little bit more. It'd be very surprising if the program that worked the best for the back squat was the exact same as what worked best for the front squat. We might see a little bit of a shift in our accessory work where the demands on the back strength are kind of different, right? Where we have this huge demand on the upper back, kind of mid-back extensors in the front squat, but not as much demand on our hip hinge. So it'd probably look a little bit different. I'd say the main things that would be core differences is I would probably be doing them just more often for more volume, just because they are lighter and my body could likely recover from a bit more. Hope that answers your question. The next one, what exercises would you pick to strengthen the hip flexor muscle? Doesn't really matter what the specifics are, but I like to see just kind of two general movements to strengthen the hip flexor. One where we're kind of moving through a range of motion in a shortened position. Could be one of those things where you get like a monkey foot and you just do like a psoas curl. I don't know if that means inherently that it has to be on the floor on a cable, but like just kind of a weighted leg lift, that kind of thing with the knee bent, like a hip flexor raise. You could lie on your back, put your foot through a cable, do the same thing, raising the knee up towards the chest. Anything like that where we're kind of loading that knee bent, knee up towards our chest position through a full range of motion for reps and strengthening it over time. Cool, that's going to be step A. And then step B is just something where we're kind of loading the hip in extension. I really like a walking lunge or a split squat where we are having a little bit of load through that back leg and we are strengthening that hip flexor when it's in a lengthened position. I find that if I do nothing but things where I'm training the hip flexor in a shortened position, it tends to tighten up, kind of yank me into anterior tilt. My low back gets really pumped up. And if I am making sure to also do something where I'm training it in a lengthened position, my back feels a hell of a lot better and my hip flexors are a lot stronger for it. Next one. If you had to swap out 4 weighted exercises with resistance bands, which would they be? So I have to do this, obviously. Let's see. What exercises do I like using resistance bands for the added resistance? I like tricep press downs. I assume if I'm still doing like my skull crushers and my overhead extensions, I'm still getting exercises that are really loading that stretched position. So I'd probably be getting that elsewhere. And I do like a banded press down. I like really that difficulty of locking the elbow. I think they're a solid movement. There was a guy, I actually coach him, who used to work at the gym I currently go to, who would always give his clients like 100 total band press downs. at the end of their workouts. And all of his clients were getting great results on the bench. So I'm pretty big on the tricep press down. I could probably be okay if I just tossed a heavy band up on the rack and I did my tricep press downs there. I think I'd probably still get pretty good results. Back extension. I do like back extensions using a band for resistance, really having to flex the hips through aggressively at the top. I think it's a good motor patterning thing. It adds some resistance. Might not be as hypertrophically stimulative for like the hamstrings because we're not loading that stretch position as much, but I do find it builds up really good isometric strength in the back, which isometric strength in the back is very relevant to the squat and deadlift. I'd say that's pretty good. I like band crunches where you like put it up on the rack. So I guess I don't really do crunches very often, but I would swap my crunches to a standing band crunch. I guess that would be fine. What else? Is there anything else I would be not too upset if I had to swap it? How much I would want to do with the lower body with the band? Did some midsection stuff, did some back stuff. Probably either a face pull or like a pull apart would be the fourth one if I had to. I think it would probably be one of the exercises I'd be least upset about swapping my free weights to bands. But those would be my 4. Thank you for asking. The next one, what's your opinion on taking singles, namely for the deadlift, after rep work instead of prior? What about when in a meet prep? Do you feel there's any genuine sport specificity in practicing singles in a fatigued state, or is the difference negligible in the long run? Well, the sport specificity, presumably for powerlifting, would be the fatigue generated by squatting and benching. The benching, unless you have a crazy arch and you're really cramming your back, the benching would probably be pretty negligible. The main thing is, if we're looking at it from a sport specificity angle, I will have some guys always squat before they deadlift. That way they feel perfectly well equipped. If a guy was like, oh no, my squats go terrible, my deadlifts go terrible if I squat first. Well, good luck in a meet because they're going to make you do that. Let's develop that work capacity and the ability to do so. Deadlifting before deadlifts, you could say in strongman, we're often having to deadlift with a fatigued lower back. I don't really rate it from a sport specificity perspective. I do kind of rate it from 2 others' perspectives, though. I would say work where I'm in a pre-fatigued state in relevant primary movers is some of the times I've made my greatest technical progress. Because when I'm exclusively coming in to do a lift very fresh and strong, I can really just rip into the weight and get away with bad habits because I'm very strong and powerful and explosive. And I find that a lot of lifters, aside from the fact that lower frequency doesn't allow you to practice as often, I also find lifters that lean into, okay, well, I'm going to wait till the next time I'm fully fresh to deadlift. Their technical development's a lot slower than the people that come in and they're a little bit sore from the last time they deadlift. So you're like, okay, well, shit, to make this happen, I know I need to be really efficient. Because for the longest time, I would wait until I was fully recovered to deadlift again. And it wasn't until I started doing a little bit higher frequency deadlifting that I came in, I was like, oh man, my back's a little sore. I have to do a really good job with my brace. I have to find a really good start position. So I think there's certainly some risk to it. And you have to be I would say a reasonably experienced lifter to want to do, pre-fatigue deadlift singles. I would say that's kind of a requisite in my opinion. But I would say that there is some really nice technical gains to be had there, at least in my experience. And then the other thing that is kind of just fun from a programming perspective is it can build in some like artificial progression, right? So let's say you plan on adding in top singles 6 weeks out, right? 7 weeks out, whatever, depending on like if the deload, right? So we got 6 weeks of singles, we deload, we go. We can do our first 3 weeks of singles pre-fatigued and then swap it to beforehand and kind of create this artificial training momentum where you're like, oh, suddenly 5 plates was going from like moving okay to moving really well. And then I can keep ramping. It kind of gives you some artificial ability to keep ramping the weights really smoothly with these linear jumps. And that's something you can lean into. I wouldn't say it's something everybody should do. I wouldn't even say it's something most people should do because they don't need to. And I don't think most people have enough precise control of their training for it to be the best idea in the world. But for experienced athletes, I could see someone having a personal preference towards including pre-fatigue deadlift singles. And I will say that deadlifting under a fatigued state has done a lot for me. So I'd probably be, I would be doing it dirty to say, oh, don't do that. It sucks. It's done enough for me that I owe it some. Next one, Sam, all caps. As one progresses in their training career, recovery becomes more and more crucial to continue said progress. Outside of the standard eat, sleep, relax, how can one manage their recovery? How do you know when you really need to take a rest day from lifting? What smaller activities outside the big three can one do to help aid in recovery? So the kind of the big, you said aside from the big ones, as long as we understand those are the big ones, and if you're trying to figure out how to manage a recovery deficit using an ice bath rather than looking more holistically at your food, sleep, and last big one, right? So you said food, sleep, and relaxation. I would say that's 3 of the big 4. The 4th one, debatably the biggest one, is going to be effective programming. There is no greater fatigue management tool than effective programming, because fatigue management is going to be built into a good program, right? So that's kind of the biggest one, is smarter programming is the best answer. In terms of how do I know when to take a rest day? Well, hopefully if your program is structured well enough, that will be predictable, right? So we would know based on the structure of our program. So how to know, if you're a more advanced athlete, you know there are certain signs that you look for when you reach a certain point, because if you're getting stronger and stronger and stronger, we're further away from this homeostasis. It takes a very deliberate effort to push our body away from the kind of state it would revert to without all of this kind of artificial stress placed on it. So we're going to be training under a good bit of fatigue a lot of the time, because we're having to expose our body to something relatively extreme to continue driving the adaptation direction that we want. We're going to have to learn how to live life under a certain amount of fatigue. And that's something a barrier that I see a lot of people run into, is they think they should feel good all the time. And unfortunately, both drug tested and untested, most of the best athletes I know, a lot of the time, what they deem normal is just a fatigued state. And you kind of got to get used to that to some degree, right? They're certainly taking that too far where it's counterproductive. But I think just being able to live a happy life while somewhat fatigued is a pretty critical skill. But when you pass a certain point, an experienced athlete will be able to point to, okay, maybe my sleep is completely tanking, maybe my appetite, maybe I've got these key indicators for me that I know I've taken that too far, and I'll take a reactionary deload, or preferably our program is written in such a way that we will probably know ahead of time when that is coming. And then the last things you can do outside the big 3 to aid in recovery. I do find that engaging in some kind of cardiovascular activity and trying to perform well on it. So kind of tracking, like, okay, well, I'm going to walk on the treadmill for half an hour. How far do I make it? And kind of just having a base mark on whatever you like, whether it's the step mill, whether it is a stationary bike, whether it is a treadmill, whatever you like to do. Maybe it's going out for a walk with your dog. That's pretty far. And you time it. We kind of establish a numerical baseline on whatever your preferred cardio is. And that way we can see, oh shit, I've fallen below that. I can't do the lap around the neighborhood in 20 minutes anymore. I'm getting winded. My aerobic condition is down, right? Because if we can maintain a pretty good aerobic condition, I find recovery from session to session is a hell of a lot better. I would say that if we're talking like low intensity, steady state cardio up until a certain point, I would say the fatigue that's caused by that low intensity cardio is less than it gives you in terms of your ability to recover from more. So I would say making some kind of effort to engage in low intensity, steady state work through the week is probably the number one thing you could do to aid in that. Next one, you've talked before about not having sufficient scapular control in the bench press to use a wider grip early in your training career. How did you develop that control, and do you have any tips for those of us who have a similar issue? So I didn't have the ability to bench really well from a wider grip, right? I've gained that over time, but I still choose to use a narrow grip because I want my bench press to carry over to my overhead stuff a little bit better. That being said, how did I develop that? Well, there's probably 2 main things I can point to. One was just the overall development of my back improving. All of those muscles that kind of move the scaps around, I found as those hypertrophied, I had a lot better control of those muscles. And the cues that people used to tell me that used to make no sense to me, like, lock down my lat. Kind of flex into this position. Maybe cue some external rotation. All of these things started making sense once I had enough kind of mass on my back to have some mind-muscle connection. Because you take someone who's really new to the gym and you say flex your lat, and they have no idea how to do it. And you could try to teach them, and a lot of the time they just can't figure it out until they develop their lats a little bit more, and there's just a little bit more there to flex. And then, I've got this mind-muscle connection. The same thing I kind of found is as I put on some muscle through my upper back, that did improve. And then the other thing is, like anything else, the best way to get better at your scapular control is to practice your scapular control. Just doing a lot of benching, thinking about what I'm doing with my scaps awareness, that kind of allowed me to find what is the kind of ratio from retraction to depression and what amount of protraction, retraction, all of this stuff that people ask for hard and fast answers. They say, well, some people say to retract through the bench, and some people say that's going to ruin your scapulohumeral rhythm and you're going to hurt your shoulder. Well, some people cue maximal retraction and it's fine for them. Some people cue maximal retraction and it jacks up their shoulder. Everybody can be a little bit different. The only way to find where you fall in that continuum of protraction, retraction, scapular depression that's going to lead to the best performance and you getting banged up the least is to spend a lot of time not just benching, but benching where you're thinking between sets. Okay, I'm going to try this. That felt like shit. I'm going to try this. Oh, that felt promising. It felt a little bad because it's my first time doing it, but I'm going to stick with it. Conscious effort where we're really being aware of trial and erroring, not just mindlessly going through the motions where we put on our music, we do a hard set that looks kind of junky, don't think about it twice, sit on Instagram for 4 minutes, go again. It's going to take a hell of a lot more time of doing training like that before you develop good awareness of your scaps than conscious effort, right? Because it's, I would say training where you're mentally present is going to allow you to achieve most tasks a lot faster than just running up mundane training time. In your opinion, is there any real difference between training a male or a female? Fundamentally, not really. I would say I start most trainees from a pretty similar point. I would say it's a pretty common average that you'll see as a female lifter gets equivalently advanced to like their male counterpart. Usually they will be able to take a given percentage for a few more reps. So maybe their percentages might look a little bit different. The hypertrophy phase of most of my advanced female athletes are a little bit heavier percentage-wise to achieve similar rep ranges. We talked about this a lot in my neuromuscular class. My professor, she had in the past done some research on this, and it was something that she found very interesting, why female athletes will present better in terms of certain muscular endurance tasks. And she basically came to the conclusion, I'll take her word for it because she's very smart, that it was like a very multifactorial thing of maybe less some muscle mass, maybe there's a neural efficiency component. Estrogen seems to play like a localized muscular endurance effect. So it's like a multifactorial thing that we usually see. So as someone gets more advanced, you might see them take a little bit higher percentages for their fives at the same RPE. And then you also see an advanced female lifter with really good efficient form might be handling more total working volume as well in terms of like number of work sets, mostly due to the total tonnage being less than the equivalently advanced male athlete. But these are things that we don't just assume right off the get-go and double their volume. We kind of start them at a reasonable base point, and then just like every other trainee, not because they're a woman, we just observe, okay, they seem to be recovering really well from this. Maybe we could do a little bit more. Oh, they don't seem to be recovering well from this, a little bit less. Now we can kind of expect these trends to appear, and it usually does, but fundamentally, no, I would say the training process is almost identical. The same exercises that emphasize certain technical qualities or certain strengths in certain parts of a lift are going to emphasize the exact same qualities for a woman. So there's no difference in exercise selection. We might see some like small numerical differences in our planned progressions of, okay, well maybe a really neurally efficient, freakish male athlete might start all the way down at 50-55% for some of my strongest guys. Whereas maybe if someone has very good technique, they're very good for reps. Some of my advanced female athletes will start their training cycle up north of 70% as the furthest they'll back away from 100. But none of these things can be predicted right off the bat because there are women that aren't particularly good for reps, and it's going to look pretty normal or like the exact same as their male counterpart. So I would say those would be kind of my initial thoughts. Next one, how did you weight train for fighting? What muscles were prioritized, and what steps did you take to avoid catabolism, since fighting requires daily hardcore endurance training, cardio, training for combinations, sparring, and so on? How much of a difference would an extra 50 pounds of pure fat over an opponent make? Ever experimented with heavy eccentrics and tips to how to add them to a program in order to do them regularly? I actually got into a discussion. The guy was raising a perfectly good point. He was saying, oh, well, it's speculated that the reason Nordics decrease hamstring injury rate is specifically due to the effects caused by eccentric overload training. And that's something that kind of best done by Nordics. I don't want to put words in his mouth. That's not exactly what he said. But I just wanted to raise the point that exact same training task can be accomplished with a lying hamstring curl, where you do the concentric bilaterally, and then you do the eccentric unilaterally, right? So my point was more so, Not that eccentric overload training isn't helpful. It's more that eccentric overload training is not something that is unique to the Nordic. It's very easily done on a leg extension or hamstring curl, as a simple example. And in terms of how to implement them, yeah, I would say that's one of the most simple examples is any exercise where we can do a bilateral concentric and a unilateral eccentric is a very easy way to implement eccentric overloads into your training. We will go to upper, higher scale movements. I just don't find it to be necessary. I don't really have any of my athletes walk out a deadlift from the rack and then do a super maximal negative. It's not really something I do. I think a lot of the training effects that we'd be looking for from that super maximal deadlift negative could be done with sub-maximal negatives with a longer tempo. A lot of the same tasks would be achieved. I guess it's all very context dependent. But those would be the easiest ways to implement it in your training. How much of a difference would extra 50 pounds of pure fat make over an opponent? I would probably say it would give you a active disadvantage. You, based on this question, seem to be engaging in combat sports. I'm sure you realize how far above and beyond being in actual fighting shape is above being in decent shape. Being in fighting shape is a very big undertaking. And if you have 50 pounds of excess fat, getting into true fighting shape is going to be rather difficult. Maybe that body weight in certain positions could be an advantage in grappling, but doesn't make you any stronger. You could leverage your body weight slightly more, but I would say that the benefits of that would be far offset by your inability to get into true fighting conditions. So I would say 50 pounds of fat over your opponent, not helpful. Especially because they could probably, if we're talking a striking sport, they could probably walk around you for about 3 minutes, you gas, and then they beat you up. And then last one, how do I avoid catabolism? Mostly just eating more, pushing more food to account for how high my activity levels were when I was engaging in my morning runs and my sport-specific practice of bags and mitts and sparring. And then I was also doing my strength training. The caloric expenditure for that is really, really high. But if you up your caloric intake to match that, I think it leaves you in a pretty good state, to be honest, and sleep a lot. Nothing too special, really just trying to push extra calories. And I kind of started to learn to eat a lot of food even before I was engaging in strength training. When I was just boxing, the amount of work I was doing on a daily basis, especially when I track and boxing at the same time, it just kind of made me realize to perform well and to get better, I need to at least make it back to baseline in terms of calories. So I got to be comfortable eating a little bit more than I want to sometimes. Now, in terms of how I structure my training, there are certain movements that I think, depending on what combat sport you are engaging in, you can kind of feel whether you're doing them or not, right? Something like a bit of a cliche, but a very good one would be a towel pull-up for grapplers. It's a very good exercise, strengthens the grip, kind of strengthens the general pulling musculature, which is something you are going to be calling upon often. So there's some sport-specific exercise, or pseudo-sport-specific exercises that you're like, for my sport, I find this one in particular, I like to have it in there. I didn't have too many of those aside from sideways med ball throws. I liked those. I had a couple of med ball throws I liked, but there weren't too many exercises where I was like, I can feel when I'm sparring whether I'm doing XYZ exercise. So I would say those are going to be an add-on. The way I really thought about it is I'm just trying to level up my organism, as Will Rattel says, right? I'm just trying to become generally stronger, and then whatever is going to be sport specific, however I can adapt that strength to be really helpful in the ring, that's going to be addressed in my sport specific training when I'm hitting the mitts, doing footwork drills, hitting pads, sparring. I'm going to learn how to put all this to use, but I'm just trying to get generally more developed. So I just tried to engage in a pretty generalized strength training program. I didn't place a ton of emphasis on, the pushing muscles contribute to the punch. No, I just tried to train everything roughly equally. I tried to do some upper body pushing, some pulling, various tasks for my midsection, both rotational and anti-rotational, flexion, anti-flexion, lateral flexion, anti-lateral flexion, all that kind of stuff, because midsection, being able to move that effectively was quite helpful. I did find that the general varied work for my midsection definitely carried over to my punching power. But I would say I really just tried to build a general strength training program, and then I would just find a couple movements that I would say, these help me. I want to make sure I'm just kind of doing these year round. But the base is not this sport-specific program. The base is very generic, or at least that's how I do it. I think trying to make your strength and conditioning hyper-specific usually does more harm than good for a lot of the athletes I know. All right. What are some ways I can implement rising specificity throughout a macro cycle if I prefer to bench with a close grip and squat high bar with a narrow stance as my comp bench and squat? Since high bar and close grip are typically what is used in a hypertrophy mesocycle, what movements would you recommend to reduce staleness in my main lifts? I would not recommend you do anything different. I think that this idea of varying our specificity is largely a way to tackle when someone has really specialized form. It becomes a very good way to display their strength, but it becomes less hypertrophically stimulative, right? Like if someone has a barely to parallel, wider stance, very low bar squat, a big arch, wide grip bench press, a very small range of motion sumo deadlift, they're phenomenal ways to display strength, but they maybe aren't the best way to build and develop relevant musculature. We might need to get a little bit less specific for our hypertrophy phases and ramp up that specificity as we go. If your competition techniques are not so hyper specialized that they are also very good developmental tools, we don't need to do that. I would say we can avoid staleness just by varying our rep ranges, our loading protocols, like adding in small variations, maybe a pause to the squats. But I don't think you would need that. I think we'll be able to fight off that kind of repeated bouts effect by varying our loading profiles and our volume and our frequency. I think that we can kind of stave those away without having to get away from those core exercises. I think as long as we are doing a good job managing our loads and our recovery, I don't think we have to worry too much about an overuse injury unless that's something you know you have a propensity to on a specific lift. If we don't think we have a propensity to it, I don't think we need to vary anything. You'll see that with a lot of the guys who their way they do their main lift is still a pretty good developmental tool. They don't get that far away. You know, if you just have a generic conventional deadlifter, a lot of the time further away from competition, maybe they take their belt off, maybe they pull on a stiff bar, but they're just going to be doing some kind of vanilla deadlifts. They don't have to get that far away because, you know, on some level, what's the best way to build muscle for the deadlift? To deadlift for hypertrophy rep ranges. You know, you could run into some fatigue issues there, but I don't think that everyone needs to implement this ramping specificity across their training cycle. I think that's almost a misunderstanding that some people have that that's necessary. I don't have that much ramping specificity because I bench with a closer grip. I pull conventional and I squat high bar, same as you. I don't really feel the need to arbitrarily Larson my benches early in my training cycle. You know, you could always play around with reduced equipment work, taking off your sleeves on the squat, you know. Those would be my thoughts. I'm probably rambling a little bit at this point. Thoughts on the 20 rep Widowmaker squat protocol as a means of developing quad strength and size for the back squat. Not a fan because usually we're going to be drilling pretty shitty motor patterns by the end. I would rather see someone do a more traditional reps and set scheme on their primary lift. And then I think 20 rep Widowmakers are a great way to build in some intensity and challenges into your training. And they certainly are a good hypertrophy stimulus, but I would rather see someone do that on a leg press. I would rather see someone do that on a hack squat, something where the technical demands are a little bit less, so we can kind of standardize a range of motion a little bit easier. We can turn our brain off and focus on fighting for that 20 reps. I would not like to see that on something with really technical demands where we can really kind of establish poor motor patterns. You know, potential injury risk aside, I just don't like when people are drilling reps with a ton of breakdown that far away from maxing when they're in more of a hypertrophy focused phase. I would like to see that protocol just implemented on a squat pattern movement that is a little bit less technical. Favored weighted stretch exercises. That's a good one. I assume you mean like do your set and then you do like a 10 count weighted stretch at the end, not just an exercise that stretches the muscle, because that's all exercises. I would say things I like doing, like a weighted stretch at the end. Calves, I do it basically on every set. I do my full work set and then I do a 10 count weighted stretch, just an easy way to keep my ankles mobile. What else do I like? I like tricep rope overhead extensions, doing a weighted stretch for a 10 count at the end of my sets. Killer, really opens up my triceps, also helps my overhead mobility, kind of opens me up through the lats. Really like those. Is there anything else I really like in terms of weighted stretch exercises? I always do a hang after my sets of pull-ups, but that's more just general overhead mobility. I guess you could say that's a weighted stretch though. Those are the main ones that I personally make use of. All right. Would you structure training to be easier if you had 50 pounds more fat to lose? No, I wouldn't necessarily make training easier. If anything, I probably might make my training a little bit harder by including different ways to expend more calories. That way I could eat a little bit more. But no, I probably wouldn't like scale my training difficulty way down. I would have expectations for my rate of progression in terms of strength to be a hell of a lot slower, or maybe even slide backwards depending at the rate we're losing those 50 pounds. I would alter my expectations. If I had a very heavy athlete who said, Sam, I need to drop like 60 pounds, I would probably have them switch what they consider their main movements to something they've never done before. That way they can feel as though they're getting better. Because if someone is a experienced, well-trained athlete and they cut 60 pounds, they're going to be losing a reasonable amount of strength. And it's going to be this very unenjoyable process to come into the gym. Yeah, I look better, but I'm performing worse. I'm performing worse. And one way we can get around that is add in something brand new where we've got some easy gains to make, right? Maybe they've never really pushed their front squat. I'll say, hey man, I understand you're making this lifestyle change. I totally respect it. I see why you're doing it. We're going to work on front squats. So that way we can look forward to seeing some kind of progress in the gym. Because if we do this extremely well-trained low bar squat where you're already squatting like mid sixes, it's not going to be fun to watch that slide backwards week after week. It's not going to feel like the training is building. It's going to feel like the training is fighting and failing to maintain when we're looking at people who have a ton of weight to cut and are somewhat experienced. If someone is less experienced, they could definitely get stronger. I would just temper your expectations for the rate. But no, I wouldn't necessarily make the training any easier. All right. I believe this is the last one we're doing. Thoughts on deloads, as I know you don't program them yourself. Personally, I like the mental clear out, although I find ironically my tweaks and the like getting slightly worse when I have a week off. Have you tried the typical every 4 weeks deload, and what informs your current method in this regard? So there's kind of three general ideologies we can look at for a deload, and all of this is really muddy. It's not as cut and dry as people say, because a lot of people would debate, well, what level of dropping back in intensity and volume constitutes a deload? Because in my program, there are cuts in volume and cuts in intensity, and cuts in volume and intensity together, there are cuts in frequency, and whether those cuts fall low enough to be considered adequate deload, or if it's just going to be a slightly easier week where we decay a little fatigue, but it's not true deload, it's just going to kind of arbitrarily be up to someone's definitions. But conceptually, we can kind of look at two different models of training, right? One of them would be the every fourth week deload. And the idea is that we do 1 week, we do a little bit more work the second week, and that second week would probably, let's say, is like kind of right below our MRV. And then the third week, we intentionally overdo it. And we kind of overtrain that third week. And then the fourth week, we deload. And a lot of people swear by this methodology. They see like a slingshotting super compensation effect from when they overtrain and then they rest. And they find that that kind of leads them to kind of slingshot forward in adaptation. They kind of really bank on that super compensation effect, right? And that's why it's very predictable. Every fourth week, you're going to need a deload, because that third week is very, very difficult. It's more than what you could do on a week after week after week basis. It's intentional. And then the second philosophy, which is just my personal philosophy, I don't think it's any better, honestly, than that first one. It's just what makes more sense to me and what I've been able to implement effectively with my clients and myself, which is more, we kind of try to hang out around that second week level of work, right? Where instead of every fourth week, we go above and beyond our maximum recoverable volume. Instead, I like to have my athletes coast just a bit below that. And I personally find that the benefits of getting in that extra week of training, because you're missing every fourth week. That's like 15 weeks a year. The math might be totally terrible there. But like if we're missing every fourth week, we're missing out on a lot of effective training time. And the question becomes whether that super compensation effect is greater than that effective training time. And I find that just accumulating more effective training will kind of make up for whatever is lost in not having that super compensation and pushing all the way up to and above the MRV. I'd rather have my athletes kind of hang out below it. How consistent their lifestyle variables are is going to kind of dictate how far below their maximum recoverable volume they hang out, because your MRV is not a static number. It's going to go up and down. Life stresses get high, the MRV comes down. Life stresses go down, maybe it's summer break, your MRV goes up. So it's this up and down thing, and if someone's fluctuating a lot, we got to put it down a little bit lower. If someone's really good with their variables, we put it a little closer because it's predictable, right? In which case, I do give some of my athletes deloads. I'm a big fan of half-week deloads. I think a lot of athletes don't need an entire week to decay their fatigue. If we mess up and we kind of overreach when we shouldn't have been overreaching, I think that, 2-3 days of easier training is often enough to kind of get that under wraps for a lot of athletes. So it's kind of the difference between proactive proactive deloads, where we intentionally overdo it on the third week, we deload on the fourth week, versus reactive, which is that's an accident. It's going to happen sometimes, but we're going to take a couple down days because we messed up. But we're just trying to accumulate as much total time hanging out in those upper zones of below our MRV, and like how far away from the MRV just depends on how good the athlete is with their variables. But that's the philosophy that I personally take, mostly because I would die if I had to not do real training every fourth week. I'd be very upset. So I've kind of built a system around that, but I've also kind of conceptually always found that worked a little better and made more sense to me, but that's also very dependent on the athlete. There are coaches better than me that have implemented the super compensation every fourth week strategy to great results. So I can't say it's better. It's just how I do things. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you as always.